What happens when the living step into a domain entirely claimed by the dead? Records show that in the summer of 2015, a father and son vanished inside an isolated, sprawling resort, leaving behind nothing but a room painted in blood. The isolated hotel stood like a decaying monolith against the darkened, stormy sky. The father, eager to relive childhood memories of a grand indoor circus, completely ignored the suffocating stench of rotting meat radiating from the main lobby. Daniel, the teenage son, immediately felt an invisible, crushing weight pressing against his chest. The receptionist, a woman whose eyes seemed entirely devoid of life, handed them the rusted key to room 123. Stepping onto the third floor, the temperature violently plummeted, creating a freezing mist that clung to the worn red carpet. As the father turned the rusted key, a faint, chilling sound echoed down the empty, windowless corridor. It was a child's laughter, hollow, echoing, and deeply unnatural. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing utter, terrifying devastation. The heavy oak furniture was smashed into jagged splinters. The mattress was torn to shreds, and deep, violent claw marks covered the peeling vintage wallpaper. The father sprinted blindly down the hallway to find a housekeeper, his heart pounding in his chest. Minutes later, they returned with a pale, trembling staff member, but the room was completely flawless. Not a single object was out of place. The beds were perfectly made, crisp and clean. The father turned around to thank the housekeeper, but the hallway was completely empty. The staff member had simply vanished into thin air. Exhaustion forced the father into a deep, unnerving sleep, but Daniel remained wide awake, paralyzed by a creeping dread. He quietly slipped out of the stifling room, wandering into the dimly lit, flickering corridor. Down the hall, a tall, distorted female figure was moving in the shadows. She slipped quietly into a closed room without opening the heavy wooden door. Daniel froze, watching in sheer terror as she phased seamlessly through another solid wall. Suddenly, the temperature dropped again, turning Daniel's breath into white vapor. He slowly turned around. Standing at the very end of the corridor was the exact same woman. But now, she was staring directly at him. Her eyes were glowing, blood-red orbs, burning with ancient hatred. Her jaw hung open at a horrifying, unnatural angle, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. But the most terrifying detail was her arms. They were stretched to grotesque, impossible lengths, dragging heavily against the floor with a sickening, scraping sound. She let out an ear-piercing shriek and began to sprint toward him, moving with terrifying, spider-like speed. Inside room 123, the father abruptly woke up, gasping for air. He felt a freezing, stiff presence lying next to him under the thick hotel blankets. Assuming Daniel had returned from the bathroom, he gently pulled the heavy covers back. What lay beneath was not his son. It was the decaying, rotting corpse of a young boy. The child's skin was entirely blue, covered in bulging, black veins that seemed to pulse. A massive, gaping bullet hole was carved directly into the center of the boy's shattered forehead. Dark, coagulated blood seeped steadily into the pristine white sheets, soaking the mattress. The father screamed in absolute horror, falling backward onto the hardwood floor. Suddenly, the dead child's glassy eyes snapped wide open. The pitch-black pupils locked onto the terrified, hyperventilating man. The father scrambled out of the haunted room, screaming his son's name into the empty, echoing hotel. But Daniel was gone. And waiting for the father in the pitch-black hallway was the towering woman with the dragging, bloody arms. The towering entity with the elongated limbs stared down at the trembling father. Her grotesque, bloody arms shot forward with lightning speed, violently wrapping around his fragile throat. She hoisted him effortlessly into the freezing air, her icy grip tightening like a heavy steel vise. "Why did you kill my child?" The entity shrieked, her voice echoing like the terrifying sound of grinding metal. The father gasped for oxygen, his vision rapidly fading to black as he lost consciousness and violently collapsed onto the wooden floor. Hours later, the heavy wooden door of room 123 was violently smashed open by the terrified morning hotel staff. They discovered the father and Daniel lying completely unresponsive on the blood-stained carpet. Following an urgent hospital evacuation, the horrifying history of the circus resort was finally uncovered. Decades ago, a dedicated circus performer and her young son resided in that exact room. Following a violent, escalating dispute with local, ruthless mobsters, both the mother and her child were brutally gunned down. Tragically, the mother died still wearing her terrifying, long-armed performance costume. Now, her restless spirit is forever cursed to wander the suffocating halls, relentlessly seeking vengeance against anyone who steps into her domain. Before we descend deeper into the darkness, have you ever experienced a terrifying paranormal event, a ghost, or an unexplained moment in your own life? Leave a detailed comment below if you dare to share your nightmare. Hundreds of miles away, in a remote industrial town, another chilling nightmare was slowly unfolding. A deeply fatigued factory inspector arrived at a desolate, towering lodge late in the evening. The winter air was bone-chilling, and a dense, blinding fog had completely swallowed the surrounding empty streets. Inside the dimly lit lobby, the pale receptionist firmly insisted that the isolated lodge was entirely booked. After relentless pleading from the freezing traveler, the receptionist reluctantly handed over a tarnished brass key. It was for a vacant room on the completely abandoned 6th floor. But there was one strict, highly unnerving condition. Do not, under any circumstances, open your heavy door after 12 a.m., the receptionist whispered, his eyes wide with genuine, unblinking fear. The exhausted inspector dismissed the bizarre warning as local superstition, dragging his heavy luggage toward the creaking elevator. Stepping out onto the pitch-black 6th floor, a terrifying wave of nausea hit him. The dark corridor smelled faintly of scorched, rotting flesh and burnt hair. Ignoring the suffocating stench, he locked his door and immediately collapsed onto the dusty mattress, slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep. Suddenly, a violent, rhythmic pounding violently echoed through the silent, freezing room. Thud, thud, thud. The inspector violently jolted awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was completely submerged in darkness. The entire lodge had lost all electrical power. Disoriented and shivering, he blindly stumbled toward the heavy wooden door, assuming it was the night staff delivering emergency drinking water. Without checking the time, he turned the freezing brass knob and swung the heavy door open. Standing dead center in the pitch-black hallway was a tall, unnervingly still figure. The mysterious entity was draped entirely in a filthy, ash-covered white shawl, completely obscuring its face. In its left hand, it held a faintly flickering, rusted kerosene lantern. In its right hand, it gripped a heavy glass bottle of water. The inspector reached out to grab the glass bottle, but the figure silently stepped backward into the shadows. It slowly turned and began walking down the desolate hallway, heading straight toward the open balcony at the very end. Frustrated and deeply confused, the inspector chased after the silent figure, loudly shouting into the consuming darkness. He lunged forward and violently grabbed the entity's freezing, stiff shoulder. The mysterious figure abruptly stopped dead in its tracks. It slowly rotated its neck, and the filthy white shawl slipped off its head, falling to the floor. The inspector became instantly paralyzed in absolute, spine-chilling horror. The entity staring back at him had absolutely no eyes. Its skull was violently blown open from the top, exposing blackened, shattered bone. The flesh on its entire face was completely melted away, charred to a horrifying, bubbling, black crisp. The deeply burnt entity suddenly unhinged its jaw and unleashed a deafening, unearthly scream that violently shook the very foundations of the lodge. The terrified inspector violently sprinted back to his dark room, slamming and locking the heavy deadbolt as he fell backward in pure terror. Trembling violently, he slowly raised his arm to glance at his glowing wristwatch. The digital numbers flashed brightly in the dark. It was exactly 1:30 a.m. The factory inspector survived the night, fleeing the cursed lodge at dawn. But the burnt entity continues to relentlessly haunt the abandoned 6th floor, dragging its melted, charred flesh across the freezing concrete. Miles away, on a treacherous, storm-battered highway, another waking nightmare was just beginning. A corporate executive named Ron was traveling late at night through a torrential, blinding thunderstorm. Visibility rapidly dropped to absolute zero. The heavy rain aggressively lashed against the windshield, making the narrow road entirely unnavigable. Desperate for shelter, Ron ordered his terrified driver to pull into the glowing parking lot of an ancient, decaying roadside hotel. The towering structure looked completely abandoned, completely swallowed by the surrounding darkness. Inside the dimly lit, suffocating lobby, a pale female receptionist stood unnervingly still behind the heavy wooden desk. Her sunken eyes were completely hollow, devoid of any blinking, as if she hadn't slept in decades. Without uttering a single word, she slowly handed Ron the rusted brass key for room 303. Exhausted, Ron dragged his heavy luggage toward the ancient, flickering elevator at the end of the hall. He stepped inside the rusted metal box and firmly pressed the glowing button for the 3rd floor. Just as the heavy metal doors began to slide shut, they suddenly, violently jerked back open. It was as if an invisible, freezing hand had deliberately caught the door. Ron shivered, dismissing the glitch as old machinery, and firmly pressed the close button again. The elevator began to slowly ascend, groaning with a sickening, metallic screech. Suddenly, the glowing light for the 3rd floor button violently flickered and died. Before Ron could react, a loud, mechanical grinding noise echoed through the tight space. The button for the 5th floor instantly lit up, glowing with a deep, blood-red hue. Ron violently slammed his fist against the 3rd floor button, but the heavy machinery was completely dead. The temperature inside the metal box plummeted, turning his frantic breaths into thick, white vapor. Then, the elevator violently jolted to a complete stop. The flickering overhead light shattered, plunging the small box into absolute, suffocating darkness. Ron was completely paralyzed in the pitch-black void. Suddenly, he felt a freezing, putrid breath directly against the back of his exposed neck. Someone or something was standing right behind him. Before he could scream, a rotting, ice-cold hand violently clamped over his mouth, completely crushing his jaw. A demonic, echoing whisper hissed directly into his right ear, the sound completely unnatural. Ron was rapidly losing consciousness from pure terror when the overhead light violently flickered back on. He was completely alone. The heavy metal doors slowly slid open, revealing a pitch-black, endless hallway. The 5th floor. Ron sprinted out of the elevator, frantically diving toward the concrete emergency stairwell. As he violently threw himself down the dark stairs, heavy, thudding footsteps echoed directly behind him. He could hear the deep, guttural, echoing laughter of an unseen man chasing him down the steps. Ron violently burst into the main lobby, hyperventilating and screaming for immediate help. He wildly babbled to the pale receptionist about the 5th floor, the darkness, and the laughing man. The receptionist slowly stopped typing. She tilted her head at a sharp, unnatural angle and stared directly into Ron's terrified eyes. "Sir," she whispered, her voice hollow and dead. "This building only has 4 floors." Ron felt all the blood violently drain from his face. He blindly sprinted out of the rotting hotel, throwing himself into the back of his idling car and screaming at the driver to accelerate. As the vehicle sped away into the stormy night, Ron slowly looked back into the rear-view mirror. Standing in the pouring rain outside the glass doors was the pale receptionist. Looming directly behind her was a massive, pitch-black shadow entity, grinning widely with rows of razor-sharp, glowing teeth. Ron never stepped inside another elevator again, forever haunted by the rotting hand that covered his mouth. But the darkness is never truly satisfied. Months later, a group of 5 college graduates traveled to a remote, mountainous region for a final farewell trip. Their fatal destination was the notorious Hotel Havoc, a decaying, abandoned structure deep within the cursed woods. Local legends explicitly warned that the rotting hotel was possessed by the vengeful, bloodthirsty spirit of a British widow. Ignoring every single warning, the arrogant group bribed a terrified night guard to unlock the rusted iron gates at exactly 2 a.m. The moment they stepped inside the freezing lobby, a suffocating stench of dried blood filled their lungs. And within minutes, their friend Neha completely vanished into the pitch-black darkness. The remaining 4 friends frantically searched the pitch-black, suffocating corridors of Hotel Havoc. Suddenly, a blood-curdling, agonizing shriek violently shattered the dead silence. The terrifying sound echoed from a rotting, locked room at the very end of the hallway. The group blindly sprinted toward the noise, violently kicking the heavy wooden door open. The horrifying sight inside instantly paralyzed them with pure, unadulterated dread. Neha was violently suspended from the rusted metal ceiling fan. Her lifeless body swayed slowly in the freezing air. Her neck was brutally snapped at a grotesque, impossible angle. Her unblinking, bloodshot eyes were completely wide open, staring directly at Ashish with a terrifying, hollow gaze. The terrified night guard rushed into the room, responding to their deafening screams. Together, they frantically cut down the thick rope, but Neha was already gone. Her skin was ice gold, and a sickly, pale blue hue covered her entire face. The devastated group grabbed her lifeless body, desperate to escape the cursed room. But as they rushed toward the exit, the heavy wooden door violently slammed shut on its own. The rusted deadbolt loudly clicked into place, locking them inside the freezing tomb. The group turned to the night guard, begging for an emergency exit. But the guard was no longer human. His eyes had turned completely pitch black, oozing thick, dark blood down his pale cheeks. His neck began to violently twist, rotating a full 180 degrees with a sickening, crunching sound of breaking bone. Suddenly, his entire head violently detached from his shoulders, dropping onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The headless, blood-soaked corpse slowly raised its arms and began to march directly toward the terrified group. In a surge of pure adrenaline, the locked door miraculously burst open, and the group violently spilled out into the pitch-black corridor. They sprinted down the hallway, carrying Neha's dead weight. But they violently skidded to a halt. Standing dead center, at the end of the dark corridor was Neha. She was standing perfectly still, smiling with a grotesque, unnaturally wide grin. The group was completely paralyzed, holding Neha's dead corpse, while an exact replica blocked their only escape. Behind them, the dragging footsteps of the headless guard echoed closer. Ashish desperately threw a heavy metal lighter directly at the smiling entity. The lighter phased completely through her solid body. Instantly, the fake Neha violently transformed. Her flesh aggressively melted away, revealing the horrifying, skeletal face of the cursed British widow. The demonic entity unleashed an ear-piercing screech and violently lunged forward, her elongated, shadowy arms stretching toward the terrified group. Ravi and the lifeless body of Neha were violently snatched into the consuming darkness. Ashish and the remaining 2 survivors blindly smashed a heavy wooden chair through a glass window. They violently threw themselves out into the freezing forest, sprinting relentlessly until they reached the safety of the local police station. When heavily armed officers breached the abandoned hotel at dawn, they found Ravi and Neha lying completely unconscious on the dusty floor. Miraculously, they were both breathing. But as Ashish stood trembling outside the police tape, he looked up at the shattered third-floor window. Staring directly down at him was the cursed widow, holding the severed head of the night guard. The group never spoke of that night again, forever traumatized by the inescapable darkness. But true horror is not confined to the freezing mountains. Deep within the scorching, barren deserts of Rajasthan, a rotting, isolated establishment known as Hotel Soulful silently awaits its next victims. 3 ambitious businessmen, Piyush, Vikas, and Amit, arrived at the crumbling, single-story lodge to inspect a nearby industrial site. The dilapidated hotel looked entirely abandoned. Thick layers of gray dust coated the rusted metal doors, and the stifling air smelled intensely of decaying earth. The only staff member was a decaying, elderly watchman sitting on a broken plastic chair. As the trio complained about the filthy conditions, the old man slowly walked toward them. He didn't speak. He just stared at them with wide, unblinking eyes and began to laugh with a deep, echoing, completely hollow sound. Ignoring the deeply unsettling encounter, the men retrieved their rusted room keys from a silent, heavily mustached receptionist. Late that night, Piyush awoke to an ungodly, suffocating thirst. The heavy room was completely devoid of drinking water. As he stepped out into the pitch-black, silent corridor, a terrifying sound echoed through the shadows. It was the sharp, metallic jingling of silver anklets. A chink, chink, chink. The sound was rapidly sprinting, directly toward him in the absolute darkness. Following the metallic chinking was the terrifying, echoing laughter of an unseen little girl. Piyush was completely frozen in the pitch-black hallway. The terrifying, metallic chinking of the anklets violently stopped directly behind him. Suddenly, a heavy, freezing hand aggressively clamped down onto his trembling shoulder. Piyush unleashed a deafening scream and violently spun around. Standing in the dim, flickering light was the heavily mustached receptionist, holding a rusted glass of murky water. Piyush violently snatched the glass and retreated into his locked room, his heart violently hammering against his chest. But the nightmare was only just beginning. Hours later, Vikas stood alone on the freezing, decaying balcony, staring out at the pitch-black, deserted highway. Suddenly, a massive, explosive car crash silently unfolded on the empty road below. Metal violently crumpled, but there was absolutely no sound. Vikas gasped and violently spun around to run for help. But standing mere inches from his face was a rotting, elderly man dressed entirely in a filthy white garment. The old man had a long, tangled white beard and deep, hollow black sockets where his eyes should have been. He was staring directly at the silent highway crash, smiling with a grotesque, unnaturally wide grin. Then, the rotting entity slowly turned his hollow gaze toward Vikas, and his horrible smile instantly vanished. Vikas violently shoved past the entity, sprinting blindly back into the locked room. When he immediately looked out the glass window, the highway was completely empty. There was no crash. The next morning, the terrified men attempted to flee the cursed hotel, but their vehicle violently died just miles down the barren road. A local, terrified truck driver reluctantly towed them, his face completely draining of color when they mentioned Hotel Soulfall. That rotting building sits directly on top of an ancient, massive graveyard, the trembling driver whispered. Over 100 restless, bloodthirsty spirits wander those halls. No one ever leaves there alive. Dismissing the terrifying warning, Amit dragged his friends back to their suffocating room as night violently fell. Exhausted, Amit began scrolling through the digital photos he had taken inside their room earlier that day. Suddenly, all the blood violently drained from his face. In every single photograph, standing completely still in the dark corners of their locked room, were dozens of pale, rotting, ghostly children. They were all staring directly at the camera lens with pitch-black, hollow eyes. Panic violently erupted. The three men blindly sprinted down to the suffocating lobby, desperately searching for the receptionist. Instead, they found the decaying, elderly watchman sitting in the pitch-black darkness. When they frantically showed him the horrifying photos, the old man unleashed a deep, guttural, echoing laugh. "The dead children love your vehicle," the watchman hissed, his voice echoing like grinding stones. The man in the white clothes died violently right outside, and now none of you will ever leave. The terrified men violently bolted for the rusted exit doors. As they sprinted into the freezing night, the heavy-set receptionist suddenly blocked their path. "Why are you running?" the receptionist whispered, his head tilting at a grotesque, unnatural angle. A sudden, freezing gust of wind violently blew the thick muffler off the receptionist's neck. Carved deeply into his rotting, pale flesh was the thick, dark, bloody imprint of a hangman's noose. His neck was completely snapped. The three men unleashed blood-curdling screams and violently sprinted down the pitch-black, barren highway. They didn't stop running until their lungs burned and their legs gave out. Gasping for air, they slowly turned around to look back at the cursed establishment. Swarming entirely around the rotting roof of Hotel Soulful were dozens of massive, dark, shadow entities, flying in rapid, violent circles. Standing dead center under the flickering neon sign were the watchman and the receptionist. They were both waving slowly, smiling with terrifying, blood-stained teeth. The three men miraculously survived the night, escaping the barren desert at dawn. But true terror never really lets go. Every time they close their eyes, they still hear the agonizing, metallic chinking of anklets in the pitch-black darkness.